sound counter. There it goes. So yeah, whenever you're ready, if you want to say hey and then call for your presentation, we'll go from there.
Cool. All right. I'll just start then. Hey, everyone. Thanks for taking time to sit in on my talk. Without further ado, I guess I'll jump right in. If someone could pull the presentation to the screen, please. All right. Let me know when I can go.
Oh, yeah. It's up, Jess, and ready to go. Go for it.
Cool. Okay, so my name is Jess, and I'm here to talk about conservation in a very critical part of the world, and that is Southeast Asia. But I'll be talking about it through the lens of the bird's eye. So without further ado, I'll just jump in and introduce myself. So I've been my journey started in 2007. I'm a conservation biologist with a para-veterinary background, and my focus, as if you can't already tell, is largely on birds. So when I'm not out in the field, studying birds or working with people that work on birds, I'm also bird watching, which, to me, it's my work-life balance. But before I jump into, like what I do, just to put things in context, I work for Mandai Nature. We're a conservation organization based in Singapore, and I head all the avian programs that Mandai Nature supports. And we're really about these three pillars, which are species, habitats, and people, because in order to save species in critical habitats, we believe that people should also co-benefit. And really, is this whole triple benefit approach, right, to conservation? And by doing so, hopefully avert extinction of the most threatened species in Southeast Asia. So Mandai Nature, where we're based, if you look at cast your eyes to the map at the bottom, like I said, we're in Singapore, and you can see a little icon for the Singapore Zoo. So our head office is actually right there in the Singapore Zoo. And so we're very fortunate to have, animals literally at our doorstep. So to contextualize our work, as I mentioned earlier, our focus is really Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, many of you may or may not already know, is an area of high levels of endemism and biodiversity. Southeast Asia hosts 4 of the 25 global biodiversity hotspots. But apart from being diverse in terms of species, it's also a land of diversity in culture, religion, and people. Unfortunately, what is equally high is the levels of threat in the region. And this collage of images just shows you some of the key threats that threaten, wildlife and wild spaces in Southeast Asia. So our approach at Mandai Nature is three-pronged. We see ourselves as catalysts, enabling and catalyzing conservation work on the ground, building capacity in local and regional stakeholders and actors, but also convening partnerships and networks, because we recognize that no one person or one organization can, save a species. We need to work together. And we subscribe strongly to the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's a global authority in conservation. And we subscribe to its conservation cycle approach, which is the Assess, Plan, Act. And I'll touch a bit on this over the course of my presentation. And don't get bogged down by this slide and how wordy it is, but it's just to articulate that our work happens in a coordinated fashion across different layers. So it's the work that we do within the Mandai Precinct, which is a physical space that we're at, where wildlife also coexists with us. The extension of that is a wider Singapore, so the preservation of species within Singapore, and by extension, Southeast Asia, because Singapore is part of the Southeast Asian context. Of particular, I do want to draw your attention to one thing in particular, and that is this little bit that says addressing illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade, which is one of our key pillars of action. And the species you hear later on are all species impacted by this. So Mandai Nature supports anywhere from 40 to 50 conservation projects across Southeast Asia annually, and that's across 10 countries in this part of the world. And over the last decade, we saw over 100 threatened species positively impacted. Now, if we look at the little pie chart at the bottom of the picture, you can see CREN and VU, and that's essentially acronyms for critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. And the bulk of our support, both financial and in-kind, actually goes into preserving critically endangered species. And these are species one step away from extinction in the wild. Now, out of the 40, 50 projects that we work on, as a team, I oversee the bird projects, and that's roughly 15 programs across Southeast Asia. This map just shows you the spread of the different birds that I work on But if you recall the illegal wildlife trade pillar I mentioned earlier, I'd like to bring your attention to two groups. The bubbles don't actually accurately cover all of them, but one group is hornbills here in this brown bubble, and the other group are songbirds in the purple bubble. And why focus on these two avian groups? Well, firstly, songbirds, apart from having a huge diversity of songbirds in this part of the world, they're also highly threatened by the unsustainable and illegal wildlife trade. And that's because songbirds are kept as pets, as companions, they're used in singing competitions, and all these practices are really entrenched in Southeast Asian culture. And because of this practice, songbirds, wild population of songbirds are being impacted negatively. The other group of birds unique to Asia are what we call the boreal hornbills. These hornbills are birds that fly and live in the high canopies of trees, and they're quite large. Now, for all of you who don't know what a hornbill is, the hornbill, the name comes from this little horn or a casque on top of his head, and hence the name hornbill. And hornbills is actually also really entrenched in Southeast Asian culture. You can see an indigenous person at the top, and he's got this hornbill figurine at the top, and that's actually a hornbill that had been killed, right, to make that head crest that he's wearing. The image at the bottom shows you another species of hornbill. That's a helmeted hornbill, and you can notice how the casque is carved. So this particular hornbill species has a casque or a horn that's very similar to ivory, elephant ivory, but it's not the same as ivory. But because of that, it makes really good carving material, and the casque is actually in demand in Southeast Asia and wider Asia in the ornamental industry. And a lot of birds are killed and shot. In the last decade, we saw populations plummet, so much so that within a year, this hornbill was uplisted from near threatened, meaning not threatened at all, to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, which is a gauge of how threatened a species is. So now this bird has become not threatened to one step away from extinction. And I'll touch on this but in a bit more detail later. So how do we try to protect songbirds and hornbills? And by doing so, also articulate what my role in my organization is and what I do on a day-to-day basis. We support two groups. Some of you may be familiar with the IUCN SSC. It's a commission dedicated to preservation of species under this global authority. And we actually host two of these groups. We host both the Hornbill Specialist Group as well as the Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group, and actually help coordinate activities and finance part of the activities of these two groups. These groups then report through us to all the global authorities. You can see here, BirdLife International, the Global Bird Authority, the IUCN, but also CITES, which is an intergovernmental coalition that looks at regulating the international commercial trade in wild animals and plants. So the IUCN SSC Hornbill Specialist Group sits here at Mandai Nature, and I'm a member of the steering committee. And this little breakdown or this chart just shows you how the team is broken down. And the team, you can see the picture at top right. That's the steering committee of the Hornbill Specialist Group. And the role of the group is actually to perpetuate the IUCN conservation cycle, which is the Assess Plan Act. And if you look at the bottom three pictures on the right, you can see 3 action plans. And these are 3 plans that were initiated and produced by the specialist group. On the Sulu hornbill on the left, the helmeted hornbill in the middle, and the Waldens and the Visayan hornbill on the right. And this is just one of the things the specialist group does, to promote conservation in hornbills across Asia. Now, if you look at this chart, it just gives you a breakdown of the threat status and where some of these hornbills sit. You notice at the top, under critically endangered, the helmeted hornbill, the rufous-headed hornbill, or the Walden's hornbill, and the Sulu hornbill all have action plans, and with activities currently being carried out to save these 3 species. We've also got action plan for the Visayan hornbill, and are working on one for the Mindoro hornbill because they're both endangered. But we have this group of hornbills, and it's more than just these 3. These are just examples, the Narcondam, wrinkled, and white crown, which currently are near threatened in the wild. But word on the ground is that these birds are getting harder to find, and it's largely because of habitat loss and clearing of key habitat areas that these birds need to survive. So what we do as a hornbill specialist group is to decide, do we need to review the IUCN status? Maybe these birds are near threatened, maybe they're endangered or critically endangered, but we have to go and evaluate and reassess their status. And that could then be followed up by creating action plans for the species in order to carry out strategic action on the ground. This is what a specialist group does. It does go through all the hornbills in the world and figure out what needs to be done for what species. Now, a subgroup under this hornbill specialist group is the helmeted hornbill working group, and I'm a coordinator of that group along with my colleague from BirdLife International. As I said, this species has a plan, and that's the little image in the middle. And a working group. The picture on the right shows you a virtual call of some of the working group members of this particular team. And the core task of this working group is actually to implement all the actions stipulated in this action plan right here in the middle. Because this helmeted hornbill is traded, we do work at higher levels of authority. We work at IUCN level and report to them annually. We also work with the intergovernment organization or coalition that's CITES, because the helmeted hornbill is actually on a CITES appendix, and that's Appendix 1. Appendix 1 animal is an animal that cannot be traded commercially, internationally. And some of the things that we do as the helmeted hornbill working group, apart from working at those high levels and those coalitions, is to actually carry out work on the ground. So, for example, we didn't know what the status of hornbills were in Brunei because the last time a bird survey was done was years ago. So in 2019, we initiated a field study to better understand the distribution and status of hornbill species in Brunei. Because by only figuring out what's going on with the species in the wild, can you then make the most educated decisions in terms of actions in preserving those birds. So we don't just sit and talk. We actually, where we can, actually go on the field and do proper work on the ground. And all these actions come into this really complicated Excel sheet that essentially attempts to chart the progress of the action plan. And for those who are interested, we're actually at a 5-year mark, so halfway through the 10-year action plan. We'll be meeting later this week to figure out where we are in this action plan and whether we have to reevaluate and reassess ourselves. And so this type of year-on-year, reassessment is actually quite key, because sometimes actions don't happen as easily as you think it would, and you have to take a step back and see what's actually going on. Along a similar vein is my role in the Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group as a coordinator. And just like the helmeted hornbill working group, we implement actions stipulated in the action plan at the top right. And just to give you an example of what we started out with, when we first created this specialist group and action plan, we had a list of 28 priority species. Within 3 years of working together as a group, that list of 28 went up to 44 species. It just shows you the sheer volume of the trade and demand, and keeping these songbirds as pets, and how within 3 years, right, that priority list nearly doubled because of the ever-evolving, ever-changing songbird trade. As some populations become harder to catch in a while, right, they start shifting, the demand shifts to newer populations, and it's this ongoing evolution that's so hard to catch up to. Just like in hornbills, unfortunately, not all songbirds are on CITES. In fact, only one bird is, and that's the bird here in the top right under CITES Appendix 2, and that's the striped Bobo. So one of the actions we felt quite early on as a specialist group in 2015 was to uplist some songbirds on CITES, on the CITES appendices, and to uplist the striped Bobo on CITES 1. Another bird that we thought could go into appendix is the white ramshama that's just flying across the screen now, which means the trade will be regulated from being not regulated at all. And so this was some of the key actions we felt were important to protect birds back in 2015, 2016. And this point's important. Why? You'll find out later on in the presentation. But in order to preserve songbirds or hornbills, we need to do research. It's all about being evidence-based and data-based in your approach. So, apart from, like I said, everything I've said before, we do carry out relevant research projects where appropriate. In the case of white ramshamas, which is the bird you saw earlier on fly upwards in the screen, is a highly diverse group of birds, and we don't actually know what we're working with in terms of species and subspecies. So we commissioned a genomics project on the bird to figure out what bird are we actually working with and what birds we need to protect. And this is just an example of a research project that was initiated by the specialist group, which is key for this particular group of birds. Within the Mandai precinct, and this is where my office is based, we have a critically endangered songbird, the striped Bobo, that also exists in wild populations here. So, apart from, like I said, working with birds in the hen, right, we also work with birds in the wild within the area that we live in here in Mandai. And it's all about preserving and enhancing habitat for the striped Bobo so they can continue to thrive in our precinct. So this whole work about, bird in hand to bird in our immediate space in the Mandai precinct. But an extension of that is the bird across wider Singapore. And myself and some team members are part of the Strata Bobo working group in Singapore. So it's a national working group, and we work together with local stakeholders to plan and conserve the species, within our island state. So you can see there's a connection already, right? It's sort of a nested approach. You've got a bird in hand to a bird in immediate space to across Singapore, and then later on, right, beyond Singapore. But what we also did in Singapore in terms of local bird research is the specialist group initiated a local project around understanding why people even kept songbirds in the first place. As I said before, birds like hornbills and songbirds are in demand in the trade. So in order to address demand or reduce demand, we need to actually understand what's behind the demand. And this was the first step in trying to figure out what motivated people to keep songbirds in Singapore. Only with that kind of information can we then, reduce the demand for songbirds here. And, moving beyond Singapore now into Southeast Asia, the Strata Bobo, as I said, is one of our core focal species. And the specialist group, along with its partners, right, carried a lot of work on this bird over the last few years. We published a whole bunch of different papers, carried out a whole bunch of different surveys. It was important to collect data for this species, to advise governments on what to do with the bird. And I'm happy to say, I mentioned earlier, in 2015, 2016, we said we should uplist the Strata Bobo to CITES 1 from CITES 2. Last year, in Panama at the Conference of Parties in November, we finally saw the uplisting of the Strata Bobo from CITES 2 to CITES 1. And I think what's key here is that an action that was decided or discussed, back in 2015-16 only came to pass last year. And that was 7 years, right? 7 years of just pulling the right people together, talking to the right people, working together to try to justify why this bird needs to be, protected from the trade. And I think it's worth highlighting at this juncture that conservation isn't something that happens overnight. It happens on a long term, right? It can take years before you see any action come to pass. And I hope this image here illustrates, I use the Strata Bobo as an ongoing example, but it just shows you what the specialist group, in a way, and what I do in the specialist group, right? How it works in a multi-layered approach, right? You have the birds that you have in your hand under human care that you're preserving, the birds within the space you live in across wider Singapore and Southeast Asia. And it's our role to try to coordinate all these activities at those different layers to make sure one activity makes sense to the other one. So it becomes a comprehensive, holistic approach rather than a segmented, divided approach. All right, so on to the nicer part of the story, or the more exciting part of my story. Obviously, with the kind of work I do, it means I have to travel a lot across the region. And this little star just shows you some of the places I've been in my work in saving hornbills and songbirds. And, I've been fortunate to be able to get my hands dirty, even though half the time I'm in meetings. Where I can, I try to get involved in local research projects. The image at the top just shows you a bird that we're tagging, and we're trialing the tag under human care because we were not sure how the tag's going to survive on a wild bird in the wild. And the video that's going to play now just shows you this is us releasing this bird with a tag on to see how it will fare, if the tag will survive or not, before we actually take that tag and put it on a wild bird. We do trial some of these things in captivity. The images on the bottom, just shows you some of the cool stuff that I've been fortunate enough to do. I was hooked up on a spy microphone, so it's a hidden microphone, and I was given a spy camera. And if you're wondering what a spy camera is, it's actually that set of car keys there. That was my camera, where lock was stop recording and unlock was record. And the image on the right just shows you some of the hidden footage that was taken with the spy camera. So the work can be really cool. It can be dangerous at times. And this is a video of, like I said, me getting my hands dirty, rescuing a white-bellied seagull that fallen into a lake and was too tired to fly. We ended up having to take it. When it got to shore, we had to catch it, put it, and rehabilitate it before releasing back in the wild. And when I have time, I also engage students. I take students out for field trips in Southeast Asia to just teach them what conservation is like on the ground in real life, right? And it's very different to what you read in textbooks. And I've been fortunate to, find myself in all kinds of situations. And this collage shows you the modes of transport that, I define myself in, from swimming in the sea to get to an island, trekking on through rivers and climbing up waterfalls, finding yourself in really small canoes, trying to navigate a really complicated river system, or on a motorbike, because motorbike is one of the most common modes of transport here in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, there's the usual hiking through the forest that you have to do if you have to go look for birds in the wild. And if you're lucky, you would be in a car, but it's often a 2-3 hour ride on a four-wheel drive terrain, which is bone-shattering to say the least. So really exciting. I mean, the journeys are really cool and really exciting, and I really do enjoy this part of the work. And this image just shows you some of the situations you find yourself in too, right? It's climbing up a huge scaffolding to get to a bird viewing station at the top, and that scaffolding is almost 70 feet high. And navigating really steep slopes, or finding yourself stranded in a mangrove or in a riverbed in the bottom left and having to pull your boat along. Finding some really interesting toilet situations in the top right. There's an image of a toilet in Asia where they uses a natural waterfall to flush the toilet and collect water. And then there's the usual monsoons in the picture on the bottom right. And this one I felt was interesting to share. This is me having to share this less than 10 by 10 meter space with 15 other people, all of which were men. And this is a little hut in the middle of the jungle, right? With only one source of electricity. So really, really interesting, trying situations sometimes. But the great part about my job really is seeing all these birds, right? All the birds I work with flying free, released back into the wild, where they're supposed to be. It's also seeing all these beautiful landscapes preserved and protected. And it pains me to think that, if we don't stop the habitat loss now, all these beautiful landscapes will disappear within our lifetime. But more importantly, working with this amazing group of people, this is just like some images of the partners I work in the region, and I can only do what I do today because of them. And to reiterate the point that conservation is not a one-man show or one organization show, it is a partnership. And this image just shows you the subset of bird partners we work with across Southeast Asia, and to pay tribute to them, because these guys are the unsung heroes in conservation. And finally, while you think all those images and trips were exciting, the truth is more than 75% of my time is spent behind a computer working in a normal office space, and finding yourself in really long online meetings from early in the morning to late at night, because you work with people across the globe. But in the end, it's all worth it. And yes, that's it. Thank you for sitting in, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
All right, Jess, thank you for that incredible presentation, and thank you for all the amazing work that you, and as you mentioned, your team are doing spread out all over the world, because you're absolutely right. Conservation is a group effort, and it works best when everybody's working together. Very cool.
100%.
So let's get a few questions in before we have to let you go. So I want to start first, clearly from your presentation, you're very passionate about birds. So what do you remember the time in your life when that passion arose?
Yes, I do. And it's interesting you asked that. I mentioned how songbird keeping is entrenched in Southeast Asian culture, and that's the same in Singapore. And I remember growing up watching my granddad keep songbirds when I was a child. And I remember being really influenced by him, but really amazed by the birds he kept. And I fell in love. I think it was like 9 or 10. And when I came to realize that my passion lied in the birds, and it's because of him, and believe it or not, it's because of his songbird keeping, that sort of got me influenced and into this track ultimately, which is an interesting journey on its own when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that gets me thinking about education. How big of a role is education playing in the work you're doing?
Oh, the biggest role. I think when you break education up, right, into different bits, there's this whole, raising awareness, because people are often ignorant. They don't know what's going on. They don't know the real roots of the problem. And you need to raise awareness to make them aware of where the issues actually lie. So that's one element of education that's important, that general awareness raising. Then there's this whole thing about culturing the next generation of conservationists, right? Students, kids even, in kindergarten or primary school, getting conservation entrenched in them from early on so that they become aware and also more able, right, to tackle the issues just because they'll be more aware. I mean, generations today are way more aware than I was when I was younger. And I think the other part of education is really important is what I like to think, or what I call demand reduction or behavior change.
Mhm.
And, I mentioned earlier for both songbirds and hornbills, it's demand that drives the trade. No matter what you do, right? As long as the demand, these birds will always be caught from the wild to feed the demand. So how do you work with people and songbird keepers or hornbill carvers or whatever it is, right? More effectively so that, you understand why they do it. Then you can start taking apart that want, right, and try to reduce demand, hopefully encouraging behavior change in the right direction for the species.
Yeah, awesome. And so education is obviously really important. You mentioned your passion for bird watching, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, is maybe ecotourism playing a role? So maybe reaching out to those in the community who are maybe going out in the bush. Obviously, they're really good at finding the birds and
Yeah.
getting to the trade. So maybe flipping the table, giving them a job where they're doing that, but with tourists this time.
No, 100%. And I think you brought a really, really good point. When you dissect this trade ecosystem and you look at the poachers at the source country, right, where these birds come from, the poachers aren't actually to blame. And when people say shoot the poachers, I actually wholly disagree with that. All these poachers are doing, they're just people who want a better lifestyle for themselves, for their kids, right? And they poach a hornbill or a songbird to get additional income so their kids could go to school, so that their kids could get medical attention at hospital, right? The right medical attention at hospitals. That's the rationale for doing it. So if we can give these local indigenous communities an alternative livelihood, one that actually values a wild bird, a wild living bird, right, in the wild, singing, rather than one in a cage, I think you would turn the tides on the threat, because you'll be tackling it right at the source, right? The people right there with the birds actually value the birds for being wild.
Yeah.
And hopefully that is the first curb, right? I mean, and it's a multi-pronged approach. You need to do that, and you also need to reduce demand at the same time,
Yeah.
right? Because so it's no one action is enough. I think you need a considered approach to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a story that we hear a lot, is
Mhm.
that, people are generally really proud of where they live and their ecosystems. And when there's alternatives, they do want to protect them. But you're right, that need sometimes, especially when it's for family, kind of outweighs everything.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
100%.
The field work. So you showed some of the undercover work that you've done. And
Oh
I
yeah.
wonder how you feel when you're doing that undercover work. Are you nervous? Are you excited? How are you feeling?
Wow, I've done it 2 or 3 times already, and I must say, depending on country, and I won't name any countries, and depending on demand in those countries, countries where demand in birds are much higher, I'm often a bit more nervous going in, because there's greater scrutiny, right, amongst the bird shop owners. You actually feel like you're being watched, and people are eyeballing you from top to bottom. It's nerve-wracking, and I think I was in one high demand country, and it was so difficult, right? So like there's a two-level bird market. The bottom level is where they sold random things, and people were looking at you, but it was quite casual. You could walk around quite easily. But the top level is what we believe so like really threatened or highly prized birds. And that changed. The more coming up the stairs, you felt that the whole environment changed. And I remember being really nervous walking around going, oh my gosh. And because I had this really flimsy spy camera, which is just like car keys. And I'm like, how am I going to hold this car keys in this proper way, right? Without attracting attention to
Yeah.
myself. So really, really nervous, especially because I had a really interesting mode of spy camera that I had to navigate.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jess, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us. I know you're at a conference and again, sharing your knowledge, which is so important with others. And, thank you for the work that you're doing, protecting hornbills, songbirds, raising awareness about it, and then getting those numbers, because without those initial numbers, we just don't know what we need to do, what needs to be
Yeah,
protected, what level they need. So that's so important for biodiversity.
yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, Jess.
Cool. Take care. Bye.
All right. I am going to stop the recording there.